Picture a one-room log cabin on a cold winter morning in Kentucky, the year 1809. Inside, by the dim glow of dawn, a young mother cradles her newborn son. That child, born into humble frontier life on February 12, 1809, would grow up to change the course of American history. His name was Abraham Lincoln. From the very beginning, little Abe's life was one of hardship and hope intertwined. As a boy, Abraham lived in poverty on the American frontier. His family moved from Kentucky to Indiana when he was 7, and he grew up in the wilderness, helping his father scratch out a living on the farm. He had almost no formal schooling, only a few sparse weeks here and there, but he was hungry to learn. After long days of chopping wood and plowing fields, the lanky boy would stay up at night, reading by the faint light of the fireplace. A childhood friend later remembered seeing young Lincoln's eyes red and his hair askew from reading into the wee hours of the night. In those quiet moments, with a book in his hands and dreams stirring in his heart, the seeds of Lincoln's extraordinary mind were planted. Tragedy struck early in Lincoln's life. When he was just 9 years old, his beloved mother, Nancy, died. The loss was devastating for the little boy who adored her. Not long after, Lincoln's father remarried, and Abraham gained a caring stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston. Sarah quickly saw the spark in Abraham and encouraged his love of reading and learning. She defended him when his father thought he should be doing more farm work instead of reading. With her gentle support, young Abe continued to devour every book he could find, from the Bible to fables and biographies, laying the foundation for the wisdom and empathy that would define his character. Life on the frontier was harsh. The family lived in a log cabin with dirt floors, and Lincoln had to labor hard every day. Yet, in those early years, he learned the value of perseverance, the comfort of knowledge, and the strength of family love. These lessons would sustain him in the many trials to come. Lincoln grew into a tall, lanky young man, about 6'4", with unruly dark hair and a warm, thoughtful gaze. By his early 20s, he struck out on his own, eager to find his purpose. He ended up in the small frontier village of New Salem, Illinois. There, his towering height and frontier strength became the stuff of local legend. One story tells how he wrestled a local bully known for terrorizing the town and beat him in a friendly match. The feat amazed his neighbors and earned their respect, but Lincoln was admired for more than his strength. People noticed his honesty and kindness in everyday dealings. Working as a clerk in the New Salem General Store, he gained a reputation for integrity that was almost unheard of. For example, when Lincoln realized he had accidentally shortchanged a customer by only a few pennies, he closed the shop and walked miles to return the correct change. Acts like this earned him the nickname Honest Abe, a name that would stick with him for life. In that little community, Abraham Lincoln became known as a man of humor, intelligence, and compassion. He would entertain the locals with humorous stories, often with a moral twist, and was always ready to help a neighbor. These qualities of honesty, wit, and empathy were all part of Lincoln's character development in his young adulthood. The shy, bookish boy had grown into a principled young man beloved by those around him. Public service called to Lincoln early on. He once said he had an ambition to be esteemed of by his fellow men, and in New Salem he found a cause in bettering his community. In 1832, at just 23 years old, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois state legislature. He was brimming with idealism, but was relatively unknown outside his town. That first campaign ended in defeat. Lincoln lost the election. It was a hard setback for the young man who had high hopes. Even so, he did not lose heart. In fact, he famously said, "My great concern is not whether you have failed, but whether you are content with your failure." Lincoln was not content to quit. He tried again 2 years later in 1834, walking from farm to farm to introduce himself to voters. He told jokes and stories, listened to people's concerns, and earned their trust. This time, his hard work paid off. Lincoln won the election. At 25, He became a state legislator. It was a modest office, but it marked the beginning of Lincoln's long journey in politics. He served 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, where he developed a reputation for clear thinking and integrity. He would ride on horseback from town to town, campaigning and later serving, always maintaining that connection with ordinary people. Those early political years taught him how to communicate, how to build alliances, and how to stand firm on matters of principle, skills that would prove vital later on. And perhaps most importantly, those years taught Lincoln resilience. He learned that failure can be a stepping stone to success, a lesson he would draw on time and again. During this period, Abraham Lincoln was also building a personal life and a career in law. He had continued his habit of self-education, teaching himself law by reading law books deep into the night. By the late 1830s, Lincoln became a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, known for his skill in argument and his fairness. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a bright and spirited woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary was attracted to Abraham's intellect and integrity, and he to her wit and strong will. Their marriage had its storms. 2 people so different in upbringing and temperament sometimes clashed, but there was love and mutual respect. They would go on to have 4 children, all boys. Lincoln adored his children and would often be found on the floor playing with them, or letting them clamber over him even in the White House years later. But heartbreak seemed to follow Lincoln, even in family life. Of the 4 Lincoln boys, only the eldest, Robert, lived to adulthood. Their second son, Eddie, died as a toddler. Another son, Willie, died at 11 during Lincoln's presidency, and the youngest, Tad, passed away at 18, not long after Lincoln himself. These personal losses brought an abiding sorrow to Lincoln's life. Friends noticed that Lincoln could fall into deep melancholy at times. We might call it depression today, especially after the death of a child. Mary, too, suffered greatly and had bouts of what was then called hysteria or despair. The Lincoln's home was often filled with laughter. Lincoln loved to dote on his boys, but also shadowed by grief. These experiences of love and loss gave Abraham Lincoln a profound sense of compassion. He knew what it was to suffer, and it instilled in him a deep empathy for others' pain. It also steeled his resolve to make his life count for something. Despite so many personal trials, Lincoln did not become bitter. He became kinder, stronger, and more determined to serve a cause larger than himself. By the 1850s, Lincoln had re-entered national politics, driven by the growing crisis over slavery in America. He had served a single term in the U.S. Congress in the late 1840s, then returned to Illinois to practice law. He might have remained a respected small-town lawyer, but the nation's fierce debates over slavery's expansion drew him back in. The United States was expanding westward, and a fiery question raged. Would new territories and states allow slavery or not? Lincoln, who had always believed slavery was morally wrong, was alarmed at the prospect of it spreading further. In 1854, a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively allowed slavery to expand into areas where it had been banned. Lincoln spoke out against it, emerging as a leading voice in a new anti-slavery political party, the Republican Party. Though not an abolitionist in the strict sense at that time, he initially only sought to stop the spread of slavery, not abolish it outright. Lincoln's moral stance was clear. He considered slavery a monstrous injustice and a contradiction of the nation's founding principle that all men are created equal. In 1858, Lincoln's reputation as a powerful speaker and thinker was cemented during his campaign for the U.S. Senate. He engaged in a series of famous debates with Senator Stephen Douglas, attracting national attention. In his speech to accept the Illinois Republican nomination, Lincoln uttered one of his most famous lines, warning that, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." With this biblical reference, he captured the dire reality that the country could not continue indefinitely half in bondage and half in freedom. It would have to become all one thing or all the other. Lincoln lost that Senate race to Douglas, but the debates made him known from coast to coast. Here was a man of principle and eloquence, someone who could articulate the nation's crisis in plain, powerful terms. Many who read those debates saw Lincoln as a new leader for a troubled time. Indeed, those words, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," rang like a prophecy over the country. And Abraham Lincoln, with his combination of moral conviction and folksy wisdom, was steadily moving into the national spotlight. In 1860, as tensions between North and South reached a fever pitch, the nation turned its eyes to the presidential election. By then, Lincoln was the surprising frontrunner of the young Republican Party, in part because he was seen as a moderate on slavery, firm against its expansion, but not an extremist abolitionist, and because his life story inspired many. He often joked that he was an unlikely candidate, a rail splitter from the West, but his humility and integrity were his strengths. Lincoln won the 1860 election in November, becoming the 16th President of the United States. He won chiefly with support from northern and Midwestern states. In fact, he did not receive a single electoral vote from the southern states. His victory was the final straw for the slaveholding South. They feared that Lincoln's presidency would spell the end of slavery and their way of life, even though Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Before Lincoln could even take office, 7 southern states decided to secede, that is, to leave the Union and form their own separate country. They formed the Confederate States of America in early 1861. The United States was literally breaking in two. When Lincoln boarded a train from Illinois to Washington, D.C. in February 1860, he passed through crowds who weren't even sure the Union would survive the month. Assassination plots were rumored. Indeed, he had to slip into Washington quietly due to one such plot. It was a perilous time, with everyone on edge. In March 1861, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office as president, fully aware that an unimaginable burden now rested on his shoulders. The survival of the United States, the Union, hung in the balance. In his inaugural address, Lincoln made a direct appeal to the seceding states, attempting to calm their fears and avoid war. In a voice quavering with emotion, he declared, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." He appealed to the shared history and bonds between North and South, invoking the mystic chords of memory and hoping they would be touched by the better angels of our nature. But Lincoln also made it clear that he would uphold the law and the Union. He would not recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate country. Still, he hoped desperately to avert bloodshed. Despite his pleas, the drift toward conflict continued. In April 1861, just over a month into Lincoln's presidency, Confederate forces in Charleston, South Carolina, opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in the harbor. The fort fell after a bombardment, and with that, the Civil War began. When news of the attack reached Lincoln, he faced the gravest decision imaginable, whether to accept disunion or fight to save the nation. Lincoln, with grim resolve, chose to fight. He later said, "I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual." In other words, he did not believe the southern states had a legal right to secede, and as president, he felt it was his sacred duty to preserve the Union, no matter what the consequences to himself. And consequences there would be. The Civil War would become the bloodiest conflict in American history, a trial by fire that tested Lincoln's leadership to the utmost. At the outset, Lincoln's goal was straightforward: bring the seceded states back into the Union. He even assured the South he would not outlaw slavery if they returned. His paramount goal was to save the Union. But as the war unfolded, Lincoln's vision of what was necessary and what was morally right began to broaden, especially regarding slavery. The Civil War consumed Lincoln's presidency from 1861 to 1860. Nothing in his life had been easy, but nothing could have prepared him fully for the strain of leading a nation at war with itself. The early years of the war were especially bleak for the Union. Lincoln faced one crushing defeat after another on the battlefield. The Union Army struggled with poor leadership. Generals were too timid or indecisive. Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, cycled through generals, searching for someone who could win victories. All the while, casualty lists grew staggeringly long, and the morale of the North wavered. Lincoln bore this weight heavily. He would spend long nights in the War Department telegraph office, waiting for news of battles, often anguished by reports of brutal losses. Visitors to the White House in those days often found the president pale and tired, lines etched deeply in his face. Yet, he remained steadfast. He refused to let the Union's cause fail. Despite enormous pressures, he did not waver from his commitment to see the war through. He used every power a president could use, and then some, to keep the Union alive, including measures that were controversial, like suspending certain legal rights in areas, a decision he felt was necessary to stop spies and rebellion. Through it all, Lincoln's personal character shone in small acts of kindness. For instance, he was inundated with pleas for mercy from soldiers court-martialed for desertion or sleeping on duty. Many commanders were harsh, ready to shoot their own men to set an example. Lincoln reviewed these cases late at night. He had a great heart for the common soldier and would often pardon men, especially young ones, who he felt deserved a second chance. There's a famous story of an 18-year-old Union soldier named William Scott, who was sentenced to be executed for falling asleep at his post from exhaustion. Lincoln learned of the case and could not bear the thought of this boy dying. He intervened just in time and pardoned the sleeping sentinel, sparing his life. Such compassion was not always popular with his generals, but it endeared him to the troops. To them, Lincoln was not just a distant authority. He was Father Abraham, a leader who cared personally for them. Even as he steeled himself to continue a bloody war, Lincoln retained a tenderness of heart. He also retained his sense of humor, which proved to be a saving grace. In cabinet meetings or telegraph offices, when tensions ran high, Lincoln might ease the mood by reading a funny story or a joke from a book of humor he kept. His secretaries marveled that, amid the darkest days, Lincoln could still laugh, not out of callousness, but as a way to relieve stress and remind everyone of their shared humanity. Those moments of laughter were brief respites from an otherwise grim burden. Observers noted that Lincoln often looked sorrowful or carried a faraway expression. His sorrowful demeanor reflected the burdens of his lonely journey as the leader of a beleaguered nation. He truly felt the anguish of the war, referring to the American people as my troubled, suffering people. This empathy, this sorrow, was part of what made him such a remarkable leader. He understood the cost of the war and did not take it lightly. In the midst of managing the war, Lincoln also faced heartbreak in his own home. In February 1862, tragedy struck the Lincoln family. His third son, Willie, who was just 11 years old, fell ill with what was likely typhoid fever. Despite Lincoln's and Mary's frantic care, Willie died in the White House. Lincoln's grief was overwhelming. Those close to him said they had never seen him so heartbroken. He cried openly, saying, "My poor boy, he was too good for this earth." He would visit Willie's coffin alone at night to talk to his son, tears streaming down that lined face. For a time, Lincoln was inconsolable, and Mary was utterly devastated by the loss. It was a rare moment during the war when it seemed Lincoln might be crushed by personal sorrow. But even in his grief, duty called. The war did not pause for his mourning. And so, remarkably, Lincoln carried on with his responsibilities. He later said, "I have been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." He sought solace in prayer and in the work at hand. Witnessing so much loss in his own life and across the nation only deepened Lincoln's empathy and resolve. He understood the pain of countless families who had lost sons of their own in battle. It strengthened his determination to honor those sacrifices by seeing the war through to a meaningful end. As the war entered its second year, Lincoln began to see that ending slavery was becoming not just a moral imperative, but a strategic one as well. The Confederacy relied on enslaved labor at home, and there was growing support in the North for striking a blow against the institution that had caused the crisis. Lincoln had to move carefully. Public opinion in the Union was divided on emancipation. But by mid-1862, he had made up his mind. After the Union's pivotal and bloody victory at Antietam in September 1862, a battle that gave the North a much-needed boost, Lincoln decided to announce a bold new policy. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, initially as a warning that if the rebel states did not return, he would free their slaves. When they did not return, he made good on his word. On January 1, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all persons held as slaves in areas in rebellion are, and henceforward shall be free. With the stroke of a pen, he turned the war into a crusade for freedom. The proclamation, as sweeping as it was, did not instantly free all enslaved people. It applied only to Confederate territories, not the slave-holding border states that stayed loyal to the Union. In practice, it freed slaves as Union armies advanced into the South. Even Lincoln acknowledged it was a military necessity act, using his wartime powers. But its significance was enormous. It changed the character of the war and the character of the nation's purpose. No longer could anyone say this was just a fight to preserve the old Union. It was now equally a fight to create a new Union, one without slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation lifted the spirits of anti-slavery Northerners and of Black Americans, both free and enslaved. It told the world that the United States was committed to human liberty. It also allowed African American soldiers to officially enlist in the Union Army and Navy, and they did, by the tens of thousands. These men fought bravely for the Union cause and for their own freedom, and Lincoln welcomed their contribution, saying Black soldiers had proven themselves as great patriots. From this point on, every Union victory brought freedom to more people. When Lincoln visited Richmond, the Confederate capital, after it fell, freed slaves crowded around him, thanking him as Father Abraham. Humbly, he told them not to kneel to him, but to thank God and to thank the Union soldiers, ever modest about his own role. The Emancipation Proclamation was one of Lincoln's proudest achievements. He would later call it the central act of my administration and the great event of the 19th century. Indeed, it altered the course of history, and it came from Lincoln's deep well of moral conviction combined with practical leadership. In the summer of 1863, the Civil War's tide began to turn. July of that year brought two crucial Union victories, at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and Vicksburg in Mississippi. Gettysburg was a particularly epic battle, the largest ever fought in North America, and it turned back the Confederates' northern invasion. The cost was horrendous, about 51,000 Americans dead or wounded in 3 days. 4 months later, in November 1863, a ceremony was planned to dedicate a new soldiers' cemetery at Gettysburg. Lincoln was invited almost as an afterthought. The main orator spoke for 2 hours that day. Then Lincoln rose, with a few sheets of paper in hand, to deliver a few appropriate remarks, which he did in just about 2 minutes. His Gettysburg address would become perhaps the most famous speech in American history. He began with the immortal words, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." With that opening, Lincoln reminded everyone that 87 years earlier, in 1776, the nation had been founded on an ideal of equality. Now, he said, the Civil War was a great test of whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, could long endure. Standing on the battlefield's sacred ground, Lincoln spoke less about the battle itself and more about the principles for which the men had died. He honored the soldiers' sacrifice, saying the living must resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom. And he closed with a vow that government of the people, by the people, FE, shall not perish from the earth. Those listening that day were moved, though the speech was so short some did not immediately grasp its greatness. But newspaper reports quickly spread Lincoln's words, and they struck home. In just 10 sentences, he had captured the very meaning of the war and the essence of the American experiment. For the older generation today, many can still remember memorizing the Gettysburg Address in school, its words forever a part of America's collective memory. The speech was inspirational and deeply reassuring. It told a nation weary of war why they must press on to ensure that freedom lived and democracy did not die. It is a testament to Lincoln's leadership that even in the depths of conflict, he could articulate a hopeful vision of a united, free future. The Gettysburg Address became, and remains, a touchstone of American ideals, often quoted in times of crisis to remind people of the core values of unity and equality. Despite the boost from Gettysburg, the war dragged on into 1864. That year tested Lincoln as never before. The casualties were mounting, and some in the North were clamoring for peace, even if it meant letting the South go or compromising on slavery. Lincoln himself expected to lose his bid for re-election in 1864. He wrote in a letter that it seemed exceedingly probable he would not be re-elected. Nevertheless, he refused to waver in prosecuting the war. He said if he lost, he would hand over the reins to the next president still committed to the Union cause. But events, and perhaps fate, took a turn in his favor. Under General Ulysses S. Grant, whom Lincoln had finally found as the capable, determined commander he needed, the Union armies began to achieve major victories. Atlanta was captured in September 1864, a triumph that electrified the North. The momentum shifted, and the Northern public started to believe once again that victory was within reach. In November 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected president, winning by a comfortable margin. It was a testament to the trust people placed in him and to their shared commitment to see the war through. Lincoln was the first president since Andrew Jackson to win a second term, and he did so in the midst of the worst war America had ever known. As the end of the war drew nearer, Lincoln's mind turned to healing the nation's wounds. On March 4, 1865, he delivered his second inaugural address. The day was dark and rainy, but his words shone with a noble light. Many expected him to give a victory speech or to blame the South for causing the war, but instead, Lincoln's address was striking for its humility and mercy. He described the war's cause. Slavery, somehow, was the cause of the war, he acknowledged, and pondered the mysterious ways of providence that had allowed the war to come. Then, in a spirit of reconciliation, he uttered the famous lines, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." He was pleading, in effect, that once the fighting ended, Americans should not seek revenge, but instead extend a hand in forgiveness to reunite as one people. He also spoke of caring for the war's victims, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, laying the groundwork for what we today might call veterans' care and support for families of the fallen. Those who heard the second inaugural address were deeply moved. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass, a black leader who was in the audience, later told Lincoln it was a sacred effort. Indeed, in just a few paragraphs, Lincoln had offered not triumphalism, but rather wisdom and compassion, urging the nation to reunite in a spirit of charity. This speech would be seen as Lincoln's spiritual testament to the nation. It perfectly encapsulated his leadership, just and firm, yet merciful and kind. Finally, in April 1865, the Civil War came to an end. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The news spread and the North rejoiced. After 4 years of agony, the Union had been preserved. The Union was whole again, and slavery was essentially dead. Congress had passed the 13th Amendment, with Lincoln's strong support and lobbying, to abolish slavery in January 1860, and it was well on its way to being ratified by the states. Lincoln traveled to Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital, and walked its streets to see the aftermath of the struggle. Soldiers and freed slaves cheered him wildly. One older black man removed his hat and bowed, to which Lincoln replied, "You must kneel to God only and thank him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." These were joyful days for Lincoln, but also busy ones. He set about planning how to bring the South back into the Union. He wanted a gentle reconstruction, with malice toward none. He spoke of leniency for the rank-and-file Confederates, saying, "Enough lives have been sacrificed." He even suggested that some educated black men, like those who had served as Union soldiers, be given the right to vote. A forward-thinking idea in 1865. His mind was full of hope for a healed nation and a vast future of peace. But that future, at least Lincoln's role in it, was not to be. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, President Lincoln went to Ford's Theater in Washington to relax and enjoy a play. With the war all but over, it was likely the first moment of real leisure he had taken in a long while. Tragically, an embittered actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. The president slumped over, unconscious, as screams rang out in the theater. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, where doctors worked through the night. But the injury was grievous. Lincoln never regained consciousness, and at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, he passed away at the age of 56. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing by his bedside, said sorrowfully, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news of Lincoln's assassination spread, and a great cry of grief rose from the American people. It was as if a beloved father had been taken from his family. In both the North and the defeated South, shock and sorrow prevailed. Crowds gathered in silence. Men and women wept openly in the streets upon hearing the news. The nation had been saved, but the man who had saved it was gone. There was an outpouring of tributes. One northern newspaper wrote, "Abraham Lincoln, who had a heart that beat with love for all humanity, has fallen a martyr to the cause of human freedom." The renowned poet Walt Whitman would later pen the elegy, "O Captain, my Captain," in Lincoln's honor, likening the nation to a ship that had reached port safely but lost its captain. Indeed, many saw Lincoln as a martyr. Within days, some ministers were comparing Lincoln to Moses, or even drawing analogies to Jesus, a savior who shed his blood for his people. Such comparisons might be considered hyperbole, but they reflect the depth of emotion people felt. In the South, many who had hated Lincoln came to realize that his death was a tragedy for them as well. They had lost the one man truly committed to a gentle reunification. One Confederate soldier said, upon hearing of Lincoln's death, "Sir, he was the best friend we had." Lincoln's body lay in state in the Capitol, and then was carried by funeral train back to Illinois through many cities along the way. Millions came out to pay their respects, standing in mourning as the train passed. The towering figure who had entered the national stage in rough clothes and a stovepipe hat was sent off with the somber reverence reserved for a hero. The assassination was a tragic, brief part of Lincoln's story, and we mention it here with the same brevity and respect. His life was about so much more than the way it ended. Though Lincoln's life was cut short, his legacy, the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln, would shine through the ages. In the immediate aftermath of his death, his secretary John Nicolay wrote, "The gentlest memory of our age has been torn from us, but it is to be hoped that the lesson of his life and death will remain." Over time, Americans of all backgrounds came to see Lincoln as the embodiment of the nation's best qualities. He had kept the Union together against all odds, and in doing so, he had proven that democracy could survive its greatest trial. He had vindicated the idea of government by the people, showing that a nation founded on liberty could endure. And, of course, he had struck the chains off of millions of enslaved people, ensuring that liberty and justice for all was a principle closer to reality. These are enormous, almost unimaginable achievements: the preservation of the Union, the end of slavery, and the saving of democratic government, all accomplished by one man's leadership and resolve during 4 tumultuous years. Historians often rank Lincoln as the greatest American president, and it's easy to see why. As one historian put it, The most lasting accomplishments attributed to Lincoln are the preservation of the Union, the vindication of democracy, and the death of slavery, all accomplished by the ways in which he handled the crisis, a crisis that would have ended very differently with a lesser man in office. That assessment captures a truth that Americans have come to recognize. In our moment of greatest need, we were fortunate to have Abraham Lincoln at the helm. His leadership was marked by deep personal integrity and extraordinary political skill, a combination that proved crucial to guiding the nation. He had the vision to see what needed to be done, and the iron will to see it through. Just as important as what Lincoln accomplished is how he did it. He led not by fear or force alone, but by appealing to the better angels of our nature. He energized and inspired the nation by appealing to its best ideals, freedom, equality, and unity, and by exemplifying those ideals in his own conduct. Even when waging war, he acted with malice toward none, carrying himself with mercy and magnanimity. One of Lincoln's greatest qualities was his empathy. He could put himself in others' shoes, allies and opponents alike. This allowed him to craft policies that were firm but not vindictive, to unite people rather than divide them. His contemporaries were often struck by his patience and willingness to listen. He formed a team of rivals in his cabinet, including some of his former political opponents, because he wanted the best ideas and was confident enough to hear criticism. Throughout the war, he was steadfast but never arrogant. In fact, Lincoln was known for humility. He often deflected praise and credit to others. After the Emancipation Proclamation, when people called him the Great Emancipator, he would say that the Confederate slaves are freeing themselves by escaping to Union lines, and that the proclamation was a necessary war measure. When General Grant won victories, Lincoln happily gave him the spotlight. This humility and absence of ego helped heal and not inflame tensions. As the Miller Center scholars noted, Lincoln's great achievement was his ability to mobilize the nation by appealing to its best ideals while acting with malice towards none in pursuit of a just and enduring union. That phrase from his second inaugural, "with malice toward none," encapsulates the spirit he wanted the country to embrace. It remains a guiding light in American political culture, reminding leaders and citizens alike to approach each other with goodwill. Lincoln's personal journey of resilience is another aspect of his legacy that continues to inspire, especially for an older audience who understands life's ups and downs. Here was a man who faced defeat many times. He lost elections, he went bankrupt in business, he endured depression, and he weathered the most horrific war leadership imaginable. And yet, each time, he persevered. One might ask, where did that strength come from? Partly from his character. His honesty and sense of duty wouldn't allow him to quit. Partly from his faith, though not formally religious, Lincoln was a deeply spiritual man who often invoked God's guidance and believed in providence. And partly, it came from the simple frontier lesson that you must keep going if you want to survive and succeed. Lincoln once quipped in his dry humor, "I'm a slow walker, but I never walk back." That determination saw him through countless dark days. For seniors who have lived through personal hardships or seen history's difficult chapters, Lincoln's story resonates. It assures us that setbacks need not define us. We recall how, after losing that Senate race in 1858, he didn't retreat into obscurity. He learned from it and became an even stronger candidate in 1860. We remember that in the bleak winter of 1863, when the war seemed unwinnable, he kept faith that right makes might, as he once said, and refused to capitulate. By sharing in Lincoln's journey, we are gently reminded that age can bring wisdom, that grief can deepen empathy, and that unwavering purpose can carry one through the storm. The lasting impact of Lincoln's vision is all around us even today. We live in the nation he fought to preserve, a nation that, despite its flaws and challenges, remains united and grounded in the ideal that liberty and equality are the birthright of all. In the decades and centuries after Lincoln, the United States continued to strive toward those ideals. The abolition of slavery led, a century later, to the Civil Rights Movement, a struggle for equality that very much invoked Lincoln's memory and words. One cannot think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered in front of the Lincoln Memorial, without hearing Lincoln's own declaration of a new birth of freedom echoing through it. The very existence of a Lincoln Memorial in Washington, with Lincoln's Gettysburg and second inaugural speeches carved into its walls, is testament to his enduring presence. Every time Americans talk about a more perfect union, or quote, government of the people, by the people, for the people, they are feeling the lasting influence of Lincoln. Every president who has come after him has inevitably been measured against the Lincolnian standard of leadership. Many have visited the Oval Office portrait of Lincoln for inspiration during tough times. Across the world, Lincoln is admired. Schoolchildren in many countries learn about the humble man who rose to lead with courage and compassion. For older Americans in particular, who perhaps heard their own grandparents tell stories of the Civil War's aftermath or who grew up during the centennial of Lincoln's time, the memory of Lincoln serves as a moral compass. He reminds us of what American leadership can be at its best: honest, fair, and dedicated to the common good. Abraham Lincoln's life and legacy teach us so many lessons. They teach us about honesty, how Lincoln's reputation for truth-telling gave people confidence in him. They teach us about leadership in crisis, how he made difficult decisions, sometimes unpopular ones, because he believed they were right and necessary to save the nation. They teach us about empathy and kindness, how even during a war, he never lost sight of the humanity of others, whether friend or enemy. And they teach us about hope and unity. Lincoln never gave in to despair, even when things looked dire. He always believed the Union would win and be reunited. In one speech during the war, he said, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." That steadfast faith carried America through its darkest hour. And when the guns fell silent, Lincoln was there, extending a hand, ready to bind the nation's wounds. For an audience over 65, many of whom have seen the world change in remarkable ways, Lincoln's story is both familiar and ever-inspiring. It's familiar because his face has long been on our pennies and fiver bills, his statues in our parks, his name in our history books. But it's inspiring anew each time we consider the enormity of what he faced and how he faced it. Perhaps some listening now recall learning about Lincoln as children, or have visited Gettysburg, or read the words of the Gettysburg Address on a memorial wall. Think of what this man accomplished in just a few years, at great personal cost, so that future generations, us, could live in a free and united country. His legacy is not just marble monuments. It lives in the very fabric of the nation. As we reflect on Lincoln's life, we feel a personal connection to his journey. We feel gratitude for his sacrifices and for the resilience he showed. We might even feel as if we knew him in some small way. The kindly storyteller, the grieving father, the steadfast leader, the president who wrote letters of consolation to widows and shook the hands of soldiers, and who always tried to do what was right, not what was easy. Abraham Lincoln once said, "The struggle of today is not altogether for today, it is for a vast future also." He understood that his actions would echo into the future. Indeed, the vast future he spoke of is our present, and we continue to feel the echo of his vision. We live in that future he fought for, one nation, under God, indivisible, with freedom for all. In the end, the story of Abraham Lincoln is more than just a chapter in a history book. It is a timeless beacon of hope and human goodness. It shows how character and courage can shape destiny. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there are leaders who rise with quiet, unshaken resolve and guide us toward the light. Lincoln's gentle voice, steady and resolute, still speaks to us, urging us to stay united, to stand for what is right, and to treat each other with compassion and respect. His life, from the log cabin to the White House, is an American journey that inspires not only Americans, but people all over the world who cherish freedom. So as we conclude this reflection on Abraham Lincoln's life and legacy, let us take a moment to absorb the enduring lessons he left us. A poor boy with big dreams can indeed become president. A nation deeply divided can find a way to heal. And the principles of justice and equality, though challenged, can ultimately triumph over injustice. Lincoln's resilience shows that setbacks are not the end. They are a chance to persevere. His leadership shows that true power is guided by mercy and morality. And his legacy shows that visionary leadership can have impacts that last far beyond a single lifetime, shaping the course of history for the better. In Abraham Lincoln's story, we find inspiration and comfort. We see that greatness and goodness can go hand in hand. We remember that our union, our democracy, and our freedom were secured by sacrifices and steadfastness that must never be forgotten. And we feel a profound emotional connection to this kind, wise man who reminded us to appeal to the better angels of our nature. Abraham Lincoln's journey was filled with trials, but he met them with extraordinary dignity and strength. In the soft, steady cadence of his words and the firmness of his deeds, there lies an inspirational and educational legacy for all of us, especially those who have witnessed life's many storms. His story assures us that even the greatest adversity can be overcome, and that one person's courage and integrity can change the world. May we continue to be guided by Lincoln's example, keeping our heads high in hardships, our hearts open in empathy, and our eyes fixed on the better angels that lead us toward unity and justice. That is the lasting gift of Abraham Lincoln's life to each of us and to generations yet unborn.